Howdy folks, Gelatinous Rube here. I'm still working on the next big grand campaign video, which is on running your very first adventure. It'll be released this time next week, but I wanted to address some questions and comments I've received since my introduction video on what exactly a grand campaign is. I've spent a lot of time defining conventional play, singular parties, and isolated tables using inconsistent applications of the rules. Bad for community play. Grand campaigns are pretty easy to define as not that, but that doesn't give you all a driving principle to chase after and pedestalize when running a grand campaign of your own. Nothing to strive for, so we're gonna fix that. We're gonna run through 3 guiding principles or definitions of the grand campaign, discuss why I think these principles make for better games, and chat a little bit about my experiences running West March's conventional play and discuss some finer points of difference. If you haven't seen my intro to the grand campaign so far, I highly recommend you go back and watch it. I do define the grand campaign in there, but I'm also discussing a lot of other concepts at the same time. So this is dedicated just to the definitions, whereas the intro video is supposed to expose you to the concept and in a broader fashion. So I do recommend going back and watching that. Alright, let's get to some definitions. First up, we have grand campaigns as a sandbox. Grand campaigns are defined as having a layer of gameplay dedicated to the overworld map, filled with factions, NPCs, and cool locations, which is designed as a sandbox of its own, as reactive and dynamic as the sandbox of individual character actions. You all know what a sandbox is, right? There's a bunch of toys contained within a clearly defined space, and that space is filled with a relatively consistent medium all of the toys can interact with. Buckets, Tonka trucks, maybe a garden hose if you're some kind of antisocial villain, all quite compatible with the sand inside the box. If you've been around for longer than 6 months, you've heard folks talk about the sandbox in tabletop games, but we're going to skip that for a moment because most folks who talk in the RPG industry don't know what definitions they're using. They hardly know what words they're using to begin with, and given that this is so unreliable, I actually wanted to talk about sandboxes in video games, specifically first-person shooters. So pretty good examples. If you've played Destiny 2 or Halo, you've heard the term used to refer to gunplay or character abilities, maybe vehicles as well. Sandbox gaming to Bungie is where you can enter a virtual instance of the game world with a limited number of players so you can choose what, when, and how y'all want to approach the available choices and content. And yes, the term is in reference to a child sandbox in which no rules are present and play is derived from open-ended choice, referring specifically to how you solve problems using your character within the bounding boxes of play. I'm sure that sounds complex, but really it's just what guns do you have and how do you choose to shoot them. The sandbox of these games relies heavily on their mediums, enemies, and environments to provide a reactive and dynamic experience. Physics interactions like a bag grenade throw, detonating other loose grenades, or the piece of cover you meleeed, flipping over an enemy vehicle. The player has a large variety of actions to take, all within the general purpose of moving them forward through the level. All of the guns and subclass abilities are designed to be fun to use unto themselves, but they're also designed to be extra fun when blended with the environment and enemies. Grenades are handy for taking out enemies. They're good at their job, they provide satisfying feedback on use. But chaining explosions with your grenade is exciting, the kind of excitement you can only get with a recipe of semi-random ingredients complementing one another in play. Let's bring this back to RPGs. Grand campaigns are defined as, again, an overworld map filled with factions, NPCs, cool locations, which is designed as a sandbox of its own, as reactive and dynamic as a sandbox of individual character actions, because much as a web spell has a general purpose, locking enemies into a single location, with an incidental modifier or rider on the combat, the spell burns up and any enemies caught within it if it catches fire. A settlement similarly might have the general purpose of keeping dwarves out of the nearby valley with an incidental modifier. The settlement can spawn a bunch of Nazgul if a necromancer happens to take it over. Sandbox style design is big on out of the frying pan into the fire or reversing roles. A web spell might keep your enemy at bay, blocking them from entry to a chamber, but only until they start pouring oil down the stairs and light it up. Defeating one faction on the campaign map, which was dedicated to keeping a worse faction in check, is an example of how this design plays out on the world stage. In other words, grand campaigns are not designed to undertake a specific sequence of events. Instead, all elements of the grand campaign are given incidental modifiers or riders designed to change the outcomes of campaign events. Once you all accumulate enough game elements with these modifiers or riders, your players won't know exactly how the world layer will react. So next up, grand campaigns can also be defined as tier-agnostic community play. We assume in grand campaigns there is a large roster of players who themselves have multiple characters per player, and form different adventuring parties week by week. Regardless of what level these parties play at, they are all subjected to the changes of the campaign map. I said in our intro video that grand campaigns are fractal. The consequences of campaign events trickle down to every tier of play. You may have heard of a style of play called a West Marches. They're similar to grand campaigns if somewhat less rigorously defined. Really, any campaign in which there is more than one adventuring party is typically called a West Marches, but we have stricter definitions and different play goals here. West Marches have dedicated safe zones. They usually have the same parties running around and often only a single referee. It's not uncommon for DMs to use a West Marches as an audition to pick and choose more invested players for more conventional campaigns. In fact, I'd say that's probably the West March's primary purpose nowadays, filtering out uninvested players to save some prep work in starting a conventional campaign. But as discussed prior, grand campaigns are the opposite. These are community builders. The adventure material and rule sets are designed to necessitate an expanding table, to collect more players and referees. Adventure threads run off to other locations where new referees can try running for the first time. Important factions and NPCs are offered up to folks outside the table to control and direct. I can appreciate the West Marches occupying a space between the grand campaign and conventional play, but I want to reiterate here. The presence of multiple, interactive, inconsistent groups under multiple referees for the purpose of building a larger roster of players and referees is a prerequisite for the grand campaign. This principle extends further to characters in different tiers of play. These games are mixed level. One character's keep could be a potential recruiting ground and even an entry point for new players. If the keep gets destroyed or overrun, it's lost as an entry point for the campaign, and characters staying there might be lost to their players. It's not just the overworld map that mixes tiers of play and consequences, though. This also applies to sessions. You could have a mid-level or even domain-level character taking an inexperienced bunch of fresh-faced newbies through dungeons, battles, whatever have you. The grand campaign compensates for the ability of multiple different tiers to support and mix with one another by allowing consequences to accrue to all characters in the campaign. If a higher-level character loses versus a vampire lord, lower-level characters have to deal with more undead in the region. But if lower-level characters help deal with the undead, there's no reason that higher-level characters wouldn't have an easier time dealing with the vampire lord. It all flows both ways. Now finally, grand campaigns are discovery-oriented. You and the players alike discover who they interact with, where they go, what they choose, and how the game world responds in kind. This style of play volleys the game's direction back and forth with the players. Much as the AI director in the Left 4 Dead and Vermintide games responds to player behavior to spice up gameplay, the referee of a grand campaign responds to player behavior on the highest layers of play. I said earlier that grand campaigns maximize the number of game elements with incidental modifiers or riders designed to change the outcome of campaign events, that it produced a game where no one knew exactly how the game would shake out. Even if they correctly guessed the rough outcome, the middle chunk of adventuring proves so variable and includes so many unexpected twists and turns that they'll think you didn't plan for any of it. And they're right, because by every stretch of the word, you didn't plan for any of it. This is discovery-oriented play. rather than relying on pure random events to inflict punishments on the player like you're playing Oregon Trail or taking you through the railroaded style of traditional narratives. Grand campaigns are focused on producing then discovering a history. You get this by taking a bunch of clearly defined gameplay elements, which are not random by nature, and combine them with a very tiny amount of randomness, player choices, and die rolls. As actions fail and players stumble over roadblocks, they seek out new methods of making progress. They discover the game world's highest layer of play. If they can't defeat an enemy faction on their own, they have to seek help. You might know who is available to provide help, but you don't know who the players will choose to seek help from. You and the players alike discover who they interact with, where they go, what they choose, and how the game world responds in kind. Because you can't know how exactly the players will move forward, and they will occasionally choose directions you never considered to begin with, you are prevented from reliably plotting the campaign's course. This change in mindset changes your behavior. It necessitates being creative, open to new circumstances that you have to respond to on the part of the players. And in my humble opinion, it makes for a better game. It makes for a grand campaign. Now let's recap our 3 definitions before we wrap up. Number 1. Grand campaigns feature a world map sandbox designed with the same conceits, dynamism, and interactivity of a character sandbox. 2. Grand campaigns are designed to foster community play, expanding the number of participants upwards and supporting crossplay not only between different tables and groups, but also different tiers of play. 3. Grand campaigns are discovery-oriented, using clearly defined gameplay elements interacting with the players and injections of randomness to discover the campaign's trajectory. Well, I hope everyone's excited to join in on the fun next week when we drop our video on First Adventures. Be sure to subscribe, visit my Patreon, visit our Discord before you go. Make sure you hit the little bell icon so that you can get notified when I drop a new video or new post. I have a long list of thanks to give on this episode. I've got Tony, Bruno, Joe, Jacob, Andrew, and Dennis to thank you for playing in my paid Lancer game. Thanks as well to Durian the Sleepy, who supports me on Patreon. You can find the link to that in the description. I'd also like to thank the players of my Chilmus Valley campaign, who've graciously acted as my guinea pigs for grand campaigns and playtests in the Chilmus Valley module. Thanks to Jeffro Johnson, John Mollison, B-Dubs, Mephrodis, and the rest of the Bro SR who sent me on this path and taught me a great deal along the way. Finally, thanks to Blue Dot Sessions for the music, and a very hearty thank you to Mariana for the art. Peace, folks.